Today, we're going to take a look at primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are original records that were created by firsthand witnesses of the event. So these were people who actually experienced the event. So to create a primary source, you have to be there when it takes place. So for example, if we're going to talk about a house fire and you are creating a primary source, you actually were there when the event happened. You didn't hear about it later. So, primary sources are original records that are created by firsthand witnesses of the event. Here's some example of primary sources: letters, photographs, interviews, maps, recipes. These are all primary sources that are original records created by firsthand accounts. Some examples of primary sources. Here we have the Diary of a Young Girl, which is the Diary of Anne Frank. In the middle, you can see Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech. Speeches are primary sources. We also have Abraham Lincoln before he was about to give the Gettysburg Address, which is another famous speech, which is another example of a primary source. And on the bottom, you have Article 1 of the Constitution, which would be a primary source, people actually there creating the events. Secondary sources are secondhand accounts by a person not involved in the event. So these are created by people who did not experience the event, but maybe researched and studied the event later. So let's think back to our fire example. So maybe a newspaper reporter hears about this and then reports on the event. That newspaper article would be a secondary source of the event. Some examples of secondary sources would be textbooks, encyclopedias, most of the newspaper articles, unless it's like a first-hand account, and most magazine articles, again, unless it's a first-hand account. The person who experienced the event wrote it. So here's some examples. We here have the Boston Daily Globe headline of when the Titanic went down. So it says Titanic sinks, 1,500 die. So they weren't there, they didn't actually experience the event, but they're reporting on it. Here we have a magazine article with Taylor Swift. So the person there is reporting on information about Taylor Swift. It's not actually Taylor herself. And then on the bottom, something very common that we experience are textbooks. Textbooks are examples of secondhand accounts or secondary sources. So, how can you tell primary and secondary sources apart? Primary sources are written or created from the point of view of a single person. That writer is a part of the action. So, for example, a photograph. The photographer is having a primary source, created that primary source. Secondary sources are written by someone who was not at the scene of event. Secondary sources uses pronouns he, she, it, and they. Both are extremely helpful when learning about history. So hopefully now you have some more information about primary and secondary sources.